Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. The eternal elevator. They all entered the elevator, without hesitation, without fear, with an unknown confidence that this was just another ordinary ride. The doors closed, the sounds of machinery filled the space, and the elevator began its descent. A few people of different ages and with different stories stood inside, as if nothing was bothering them. None of them suspected that this would not just be a ride, but something far more terrifying. The elevator was simply a window to another dimension, where neither time nor space existed. Each one of those who entered it was doomed. At first, nothing happened. The elevator moved, quietly, without interruption. A brief conversation began between the people. A young man in a dark suit joked that he seemed to be stuck on a few floors, and a middle-aged man with tightly clenched fists pointed to a sign that lit up on the number panel. "Floor 43, he mumbled. But something was wrong. The elevator stopped. Total silence, only the faint mechanical hum. And then, instead of moving forward, the doors opened again. In an instant, everything changed. The fresh air they felt seemed bitter, sharp, and the whole room looked old, forgotten. No one could remember when this had happened, but each of them felt an inexplicable anxiety. And suddenly, they heard footsteps. At first barely audible, but then, as if someone was approaching faster and faster. But the doors didn't open. The elevator started moving again, and the numbers on the panel began to flicker. And again, it stopped. And again, the doors opened. This time, everything was different. The people began to notice that they were no longer just moving down. They felt as if they were moving into the depths of hell itself. Each floor brought new horrors. They had all become trapped. The people who had seemed normal at first began to behave strangely. Those who tried to speak about their fears suddenly felt that they were being listened to, but not understood. And this was even more terrifying than the mere loss of sanity. The elevator didn't stop. Each floor turned out to be just the beginning of a nightmare. This was a place where experiments were conducted. Terrible experiments on the souls of people. Everything that had once seemed real was now just an illusion. With every empty floor, someone disappeared again and again, dissolving into the darkness. And there were no chances left to escape. The elevator gained speed again, and even its metal walls seemed to tremble from an unknown force that was gradually squeezing the last remnants of calm out of each of the people present. After several minutes of relentless descent, the mechanical noise quieted again. Now, every sound in the elevator was deafening. Suddenly, the numbers on the panel began to change erratically, without any logic. 113, 234, 505. The elevator was approaching the next floor. The doors opened once more. Before them was a cold, dark corridor, and in this corridor, it seemed there was no end. It was not like any ordinary floor of a building. The walls were invisible due to the black fog that filled the space. Only blurred silhouettes, which seemed to emit shadows, stood motionless. The young man in the suit, who had started joking earlier, was the first to step out. His persistence and desire to find an exit seemed to outweigh the fear that had gripped the others. Step by step, he approached the darkness, but then suddenly stopped. A distant, muffled sound like the clanging of metal was heard. His legs grew heavier, and he felt an invisible force swallowing him. It was as if something in the air was pulling him back. Suddenly, something cracked, and everything became quiet. Turning around, he saw the elevator doors closing again, locking him in an unknown space. No one moved anymore. The one who had dared to step out never returned. The others stood silently. Their eyes were filled with boundless terror. Everyone left behind stared into the darkness, knowing that each subsequent floor would be even more dangerous. Each of them had the feeling that they had become part of an experiment. And this experiment continued deeper and deeper with every new floor. Suddenly, the doors opened again. This time, the light was dead, cold, and the people saw what they had tried to hide from themselves all these hours. On the floor lay a pile of bodies. People with various expressions of fear on their faces. Some were curled into a ball, others were sprawled out. All of them were dead. They were like us, thought one of the remaining survivors. He realized, these were those who had already tried to escape but had fallen into the trap. The elevator never had a bottom. It was endless. And those who entered it never had a chance. The doors closed. They started moving downward again, and a new number appeared on the panel, 666. Time was slipping away, and in the hearts of each person, one thought solidified. They had become part of something horrifying that they would never understand. There was no more time. The elevator moved into infinity, to a place where there were no boundaries, where there was no freedom. Where each floor was just the next stage of destruction, and where the darkness consumed everything around. The elevator continued its endless journey in the darkness, and inside, each of the remaining people felt more and more isolated. The silence in the cabin was thick, it could almost be cut with a knife. People no longer spoke to each other. They began to perceive one another as part of this terrifying place, which was consuming them in darkness and fear. Their eyes seemed empty, without any expression. But once, when the elevator seemed to stop at the next floor, a new transformation began. It was something more than just a descent. Time seemed to stop. And then, the doors opened again, but this time they didn't lead to a simple corridor. Behind them was only a dark, slippery wall, resembling blood stained in a deep red color. It was so realistic that it almost hurt to look at it. And again they saw it. The people lying on the floor were not dead, they were changed. Their faces were twisted in horror, but their eyes didn't look into the darkness, they looked at the remaining people. And they smiled. It was a smile full of pain and hopelessness, indicating that they were not simply victims of experiments. They had become parts of this place, consumed by its horrifying experiments, victims who had now become part of it. One of them, the same man in the suit who had first dared to step out, was visible in the foreground. He stood among the others, but he was different. He was no longer alive, but not dead either. His skin was pale, and his gaze empty. But in his eyes reflected endless anxiety, and it seemed he was once again trying to warn the others. "They're testing us. We're here forever," he whispered in a barely audible voice, almost like a plea. And suddenly, swallowing those words, the remaining ones began to realize that what they were experiencing was not just a physical nightmare. They had become part of an experiment that had no logic, no meaning. It was an endless journey down where time and space no longer existed. Meanwhile, the elevator began to move again. It moved, but this movement was no longer just physical. It was felt inside each one, shifting reality. People felt their bodies growing heavier, as if each movement down was taking away a part of their soul. They felt that everything happening to them was just an attempt to strip them of their humanity, leaving them as empty shells, capable only of feeling pain. At the moment when the doors closed again, a new number appeared inside. 999. Everyone understood, they had become part of an endless cycle. Each floor was a new stage of the experiment, a new moment of despair. It was unknown how long they had been moving. No one could determine how many times they had already passed through these doors, how many times these horrifying places had opened, but they no longer remembered what normality was. It was no longer just a descent. It was a place where each floor was a different reality, where the mind was lost, and people became part of something dark and merciless. Everyone began to understand. They would never escape. And even if they wanted to, the elevator no longer responded to any requests, didn't stop, and wouldn't allow them to move forward. It had become nothing but an endless prison. The elevator had turned into an eternal nightmare. Each subsequent floor became more nightmarish. And even if the doors opened, there was nothing but emptiness. But everyone who stepped into this emptiness felt their soul being crushed, and their body became nothing more than a shell, discarded into the darkness. The elevator stopped again. The mechanism first fell silent, then hummed quietly, as if ready to depart once more. The doors opened. This time, the remaining people saw nothing but complete darkness. They tried to stretch out their hands to the edge of the elevator, to touch the walls or somehow understand where they were. But the darkness swallowed everything they did. It became almost alive, as though the darkness itself could hear their movements and responded with a silence that grew deeper. Each breath became heavier, each word constricted. And then, amid this uncertainty and horror, a voice sounded. It was cold, abrupt, as if the emptiness itself, radiating terror, was speaking. "You are all already part of the experiment." The words were spoken slowly, as if some inner truth was penetrating each of the present people, completely altering their perception. "You are all irreversibly lost. But you need not worry. This is only the first stage." Inside the elevator, it became even darker, and these words seized their thoughts. Why were they here? What were these experiments? What did they mean by the first stage? All the remaining ones began to feel like they were not just parts of some system, but of a laboratory, where they were simply mice in an experiment with no chance of escape. One of them, an older man, couldn't take it. He tried to grab the control panel, pressing the button again, hoping it might help in some way. But nothing happened. The elevator didn't respond. And then he began to scream. He screamed as if it was the only thing he could do. He screamed for help, for salvation, for the fact that they shouldn't have ended up here. But neither his cries nor his moans mattered anymore. He turned to the others, his eyes filled with despair. "It's a trap. We'll never get out. They'll destroy us. They'll test us until we break." And his voice became quieter until it fell silent. Then something happened that they could never have imagined. Those who remained suddenly felt the gazes upon them. Not just gazes, but something more, something terrifying, something that penetrated every cell of their bodies. They saw shadowy figures moving around them, like living shadows that were closing in. They had no faces, they were only dark outlines moving in sync with the elevator. Something ominous was felt in each of their movements. Suddenly, these shadows began to speak. Their voices were uneven, mechanical, and once again, the same words. "Did you not understand? This is not just a ride. You are part of the experiment." And then everything became clear. They were no longer ordinary people. They were objects, parts of this enormous experiment. Their pain and fear, that was what was being measured, what was being analyzed. It was only a matter of time before their loss of feelings would become the next stage. The elevator moved again. And again, the darkness spread its influence on each of them. The elevator stopped, but this time the doors did not open. Nothing happened. Everyone once again felt the pressure emanating from the elevator itself, as if this mechanism had become part of their existence. It moved not just down. It moved through them. "You feel it all, don't you?" whispered one of them, peering into the darkness. "This is just the beginning." The elevator doors remained closed for a long time, and only the soundless rumble suggested that everything was continuing. And when they finally felt that their legs could no longer stand, that their bodies were betraying them, they understood. There was no more way out. They had become part of this endless cycle. But something had changed. The elevator began moving down again. This time, before them, another dark, empty space appeared. And once again, a new number appeared on the panel. 000. Now they had become part of something even more terrifying, more dangerous. And only emptiness was their companion. The elevator seemed to never stop. It moved, and even those who were the strongest began to lose their ability to perceive reality. Fear gradually turned into a disgusting feeling of emptiness inside. They were no longer humans in the classical sense of the word. They were parts of this mechanism. Parts that existed only to test the limits of their pain and fear. This time, the elevator started moving at a speed that was shocking. The doors didn't open immediately. They only dreamed of it, the moment when the movement would finally stop, and they would see at least a sliver of reality. But each movement of the elevator was worse than the last. Each turn of the gears, each break in the mechanism, killed them and brought them back to life, transforming them into even greater martyrs of this horrifying cycle. And then, amidst the loud buzzing of the mechanisms, one of them noticed something strange. A new message appeared on the panel next to the buttons, a text that changed so quickly that it was impossible to read it fully. It was incomprehensible, chaotic, but one phrase remained clear: "Each of you has your countdown." "What does this mean?" asked one of the remaining ones. His voice sounded trembling, but again, there was no answer. Everyone fell silent. The terrifying shadows, which had been felt in the darkness, now became clearer. They were no longer just silhouettes. They took form. Each movement was like an emergence from the afterlife, and with each step, they grew closer. But these were not ordinary entities. They were their own reflections, their fears, their nightmares that had now emerged from the darkness and become reality. "Do you understand now? This is no longer an elevator. This is a labyrinth," whispered one of the shadows, and her voice was both calm and chilling. The doors opened, and now, before them, there was not just emptiness. It was a dark corridor, resembling an experimental chamber. White walls with bloodstains. Thin wires hung from the ceiling, not just connected to the mechanisms. They seemed to merge with the walls themselves, with organic tissues that trembled from electrical tension. And at that moment, they saw something that had initially seemed like a hallucination. Figures stood on the floor, arranged in perfect rows. They were dead bodies. Bodies that had once been the residents of this nightmare. They looked as though they had long ceased to be human. Their bodies were deformed, altered, as though someone had tried to create a new form of life from these horrifying pieces of flesh and bone. But even worse was the fact that some of these bodies moved. They revived for a moment, moving their limbs, then froze again, leaving behind only a dark tear that slowly spread across the floor. It was impossible to say whether these were former experimenters or another one of their victims, now trapped in this world without reality. And when one of the present ones tried to approach one of these bodies, he saw how it suddenly awoke, without sound, without words, but once again watching them. Each movement, each glance from these deformed faces left a feeling in the heart that their fate was only part of an unfinished experiment. They had become mere parts of a giant machine, and this machine was the elevator. Everyone realized that escape was impossible. They were no longer human. They were living bodies existing to endure and be studied, to become parts of something horrifying, something that had neither a beginning nor an end. The elevator moved down again. But everyone who remained in it knew, this was not just movement. This was a fall. And the fall was endless. The elevator continued its journey, but now it seemed to be something more than just transportation. It had become a part of their existence, a part of a horrific, endless reality where time and space no longer existed. This mechanism was their prison, their death sentence. The doors opened again, but this time nothing was visible. Only deep darkness, which swallowed everything, as if it itself had become their enemy. They felt every movement of the elevator, every turn of the gears, filling their bodies with hellish pain. They all realized that their souls had long since left them, and now they were just empty shells serving this terrifying mechanism. In the darkness, there were quiet rustlings, incomprehensible sounds that awakened feelings of fear and despair. The shadows began to move again, but now they took form, the form of people who had long ceased to be alive. They stood in front of the doors, their faces empty, their expressions frozen in eternal fear. They looked at those who remained, silently, without words. Their eyes had no soul. And suddenly, one of these shadows stepped forward. It didn't just move, it glided. Quickly, silently, with merciless precision. Everyone felt their hearts start to beat twice as fast. "You understand now, don't you?" whispered the shadow, and its voice was inhuman. It was a sound wave that penetrated deep into their souls. "You've become part of the endless cycle. You're here forever. Those who were before you have long become part of us. And you will become the same. Their bodies trembled. They felt everything inside them shatter. They were no longer human. They had become just like these deformed figures standing before them. They had become part of the experiment. They had become part of this endless reality. And suddenly, they saw something they could never have seen before. In the darkness of the elevator, other shadows appeared. They began to fill the space. First, just one. Then two. Then three. And so on, until the elevator was overcrowded with bodies that had no faces, only empty shells filled with horror and torment. And each of them felt it. They felt how these bodies began to slowly merge into them, how their parts were absorbed, becoming part of their consciousness, part of their soul. They became one with these beings, and their own thoughts no longer belonged to them. But the most terrifying thing happened when one of those left in the elevator asked, "Why can't we get out? Why can't we just die?" And immediately, everyone heard the answer. It was not a human answer. It was the answer of the elevator itself, which seemed to blend with the fog around them. "You won't die," the voice said. "You'll just be part of this place. Forever. Your existence has become an illusion, to make you think there is still hope. But there is only the fall." The shadows drew closer. They enveloped each of those present, wrapping them in their cold touch. And at that moment, each one felt their own flesh begin to melt gradually, blending with the elevator's mechanisms, as if part of a great living entity. Their mental processes slowed, and with each passing moment, they became less and less human. The elevator moved on. And before them appeared yet another number. Infinity. This was not just a downward movement. It was a movement into infinity. And now they had become part of this endless circle. They no longer had feelings, no longer had their own thoughts. They had become shadows, just like those who had already become part of this horrific place. Their fall was endless. And they could no longer escape. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.